have been working on my art very frantically recently because I have an exhibition coming up. Yay! So here's one of my big-ass drawings behind me. And in preparation for this exhibition, I went to my old university to print off some gallery invites. And while I was there, I saw that one of the professors was giving away all of their old art books. So I eagerly grabbed a few, and one of the books that I grabbed is this one, The Politics of Surrealism by Helena Lewis. I really enjoyed this book. I'm so glad I picked it up. It was a really fun, engaging deep dive into the political underpinnings of one of my favorite art movements. It starts off by talking about the Dada movement, which was an art movement that came directly from the horrors of World War I. You see, during World War I, every aspect of society was funneled into fueling the war, whether it be art, or science, or mass media, or education. So the Dadaists revolted against every aspect of those conventions that led society down such a horrible path. They were rebelling against conventional art and language. They would often cut up mass media and rearrange it in a subversive existentialist kind of way. And they had very notorious performance pieces which led to riots and stuff. In case you're wondering how a piece of performance art could lead to riots, Lewis gives a pretty good example in here. She writes, "To celebrate Zara's arrival, Literature organized a matinee on the new art. The public appeared, unaware of the intended farce, to find Picabia ostensibly lecturing on art, but really erasing lines on the blackboard as fast as he drew them. Zara, after announcing a manifesto, read from the telephone book, while the others rang cowbells to drown him out. Raymond Dessalles addressed the audience in such an insulting fashion that he caused a riot. The first Paris Dada event was judged a huge success." So right there you can see one of the book's main strengths, which is that Lewis doesn't ever fall into pure academia with her writing. She's very accessible, and because she's pulling from real events and quoting from manifestos and articles and letters, she really immerses you in the thinking of the period. Later on in the book, there's a rift in the Dada movement that causes artists to split off and form the Surrealist movement. Lewis does a great job not only of explaining how Dada and Surrealism went hand in hand, but of explaining their critical differences that led to the rift in the first place. Dadaism and Surrealism were similar in the sense that they both wanted to create work that subverted the normal order of things. But Surrealism was different from Dada in the sense that it assigned itself to particular ideologies in order to achieve this. So it wanted to liberate both the mind of the individual as well as the masses. For the mind, it focused on Sigmund Freud and his interpretation of the unconscious and dream analysis, whereas for the masses, it was really interested in Karl Marx and how he wanted to liberate society from being greed-driven and all the stuff that led to the war. And so you see those two things sort of playing with each other as the Surrealists develop their style. They start by developing automatic writing and automatic drawing and other methods of like unlocking the imagination, whereas at the same time they were also writing articles that were very political, they were anti-nationalist, they were anti-war, and that led the Surrealists to becoming pariahs to basically everyone who wasn't a communist, which is what led the two groups to coming together. Now, this book is just under 200 pages, which means it has to be sort of hyper-focused on just talking about the political writing and the political stuff. So if you go into this expecting like an analysis of how Salvador Dali's clocks were all about how, oh, the time for revolution is now, man, then you're probably going to be a little disappointed. And I have to admit that I was a little bit disappointed when I first realized how narrow the scope of the book was going to be. But I was quickly pulled right back in when I realized just how interesting Helena Lewis was able to make the subject of political surrealism. The Surrealists progressively became more and more political as they fully embraced communism and moved into the orbit of the Soviets. But it's not a match made in heaven, and there's a lot of tensions and dramas that break out as a result of this shaky alliance. One of the main points of contention is that the Soviet brand of communism was obsessed with the collective at the expense of the individual, and they were also obsessed with things like objective truth. Whereas for the surrealists, they were really interested in the imagination of the individual, and they thought that subjective interpretation was just as important, if not more important, than objective reality, especially when it came to the arts. Another contention is that the Soviets were weirdly Puritan in a lot of ways, whereas the surrealists wanted to embrace every taboo. And they really wanted the Soviets to understand the importance of liberating repressed imaginations as well as liberating the masses. As new tensions and alliances come up throughout the book, Lewis makes sure to never put anybody on a pedestal, and she is very quick to point out the hypocrisies and contradictions within the respective ideologies. There's this one really funny section where the surrealists hold a conference on sexual liberation. Now, some of the members of surrealism were very fluid with their gender and sexuality, so I figured it would be relatively progressive, but they excluded all the women because they say the women would only complicate things, and then they go on to speculate about whether or not women can orgasm, and that they actually find gay people kind of icky. So they're high and mighty when it comes to politics, but as soon as they start talking about sex, they all turn into 13-year-old boys. And there's just plenty of bizarre anecdotes as Lewis describes the intrigues and the denunciations. As the dramas start to snowball together, it becomes a little bit overwhelming to keep track of which person is in whose good graces, who caused what controversy, and so on. But then you get to the last quarter of the book, and that's by far my favorite section. That's when everything starts happening at once. You have the rise of the Nazis and the persecution of artists. You have a huge rift in the Soviet Union, which leads to the expulsion of Trotsky. And you have the Popular Front, which is all about maintaining the status quo. Most importantly, for the narrative of this book, you also have the start of a new art movement called Socialist Realism, which completely eclipses all other styles of art in the Soviet Union. There's a great section explaining it, how it's all about presenting this utopian future that we can all achieve if we just work together. It's basically propaganda, and all the artists in that orbit are expected to be part of it. And the surrealists don't want to be part of it, so they run off to Trotsky, and together they write this big manifesto, which was required reading when I was in university, about how art should be free from the shackles of authoritarianism, regardless of what political side you're on. And while art should still be revolutionary, preferably, it should never be at the cost of losing individual expression. And after seeing so much pressure on the surrealists from the political left, right, and center, it's a big breath of fresh air to read something like that. I really do appreciate books like this for putting art movements in their proper political social context. But on the other hand, it's kind of a double-edged sword. The narrow scope of this book, focusing on politics of just surrealism, means that I think Lewis misses out on some important stuff. At one point she claims that surrealism is the first art movement to join with the communists, and that's not entirely true, because there were art movements like suprematism and constructivism in the Soviet Union, which formed alongside the Bolshevik Revolution. So maybe she means that surrealism is the first art movement that was external to communism to join up. But even if that's the case, I would have liked to see her discuss those Soviet types of art, because it would lay a good groundwork for the rigidity of style and form that you saw later in socialist realism. And it would be a good way of contrasting that rigidity with the flowing stream of consciousness style of the surrealists. The other thing that I wish the book had done more of is to look at some of the art and actually analyze it. Like I alluded to earlier, I would have liked to see how the actual art played into what they believed politically. I mentioned earlier how this book isn't overly academic in the style of the writing, but at the same time it doesn't hold your hand either, meaning it assumes that you have a basic groundwork for certain events like political movements and their implications, or artists and their movements. So yeah, I would say that this is mostly meant to be supplementary. Like, if you're brand new to surrealism, this is not a good place to start at all. You're probably better off watching a documentary and then using this to fill in the gaps about their political motivations. I would still have liked to see a few more subjects being fleshed out a bit more. What I appreciate most about books like this, especially as an artist myself, is that they're great reminders to show that art is often a lot more than just pretty pictures on a wall. Very often it's informed by the philosophy and the worldview and the politics of the creator. My own work, for example, is heavily inspired by theory, so I couldn't help but relate to the explorations of the artists in this book. Overall, I give The Politics of Surrealism a 7 out of 10. I would have preferred if it was fleshed out a little bit more and if it pulled in more context to build the narrative, but overall it was a great reminder of art's ability to communicate and challenge and provoke. If you're interested in art books and you have recommendations, or if you want to just talk about art in general, I'd love to hear from you because art is, and always will be, probably my favorite subject. So let me know if you have any thoughts on this video. I'd love to hear from you. But I guess I am done with this video for now, so thank you for watching. I'm a head out. See you later. Thank you, and goodbye.